Hey, it's me, Rose La Fabiloca, and we are going to take down white supremacy, one pendejo at a time. This is the Sabe podcast. Hi everyone, I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. So a few things, a lot of you have asked me about Friday Night Special. For right now, I have taken a step back from those because working them into my schedule is a little difficult at the moment. And I'd rather have that sort of content on my personal Instagram than my YouTube just for the sake of consistency with episode numbering, etc. So for right now, I'm holding off on doing Friday Night Specials on my YouTube, but I might do like some have suggested and make it like a small thing I do on IGTV or something. Who knows? We shall see. But anyway, let's hop right into this episode, American Privilege, because we have no time to waste. We have a lot to unpack today. So let's get started. You guys, this is our 10th episode in the Jatu Sabe podcast series, and I am so happy we are just trucking along with all of these different social issues. I love that you guys reach out to me after you finish each episode and dive in a little deeper on your own and come back to me with questions and comments. I love that. I'm stimulating everyone and really getting you thinking about your identity with yourself and your identity with the world. Now, American privilege is something I mentioned very lightly in my last episode when we discussed racism and colorism and how it became embedded in the Hispanic community over the course of centuries. But in the same vein, I really want to take from last week's lesson and build upon it more in order to really bring us into the grand intersection between African American communities in America and other ethnic groups like Hispanics who also have Black people within their minority group. So when we discuss places like the Dominican Republic and refer to them as third world countries, what are we really insinuating? Because as many people understand the meaning based off of context, they don't really understand the meaning, right? Like someone who has traveled to a third world country, whether to see family or to do missionary work, they're going to have a deeper understanding of what it means to be from or live in a third world country because they've been exposed to it through travel. So for example, in the Dominican Republic, my family does pretty well for themselves and they're very established and profitable industries like journalism and banking. But even they, living in a third world country, have limitations that we don't see in America when we are middle or upper class and beyond. For example, the government in these countries can be more likely to be crooked, as if ours isn't, right? And I've heard stories like how the utility company will be collecting people's payments and then not paying their own bills, and then the power will be shut off for the people on the island in DR. Or like, for example, they don't live with central air conditioning, a lot of them. They have small portable units maybe in a bedroom here or there, but they don't have like a central air and heating like we do. And while that's not necessarily what defines a third world country, I just want to give a small example of what life can be like when the structure of a government and a country is faulty to begin with. And it really doesn't allow for its citizens to really live absolutely comfortably in relation to how hard they work. Because these people in these third world countries work just as hard as people in America do, so why are they not seeing the same results as a community? It's honestly so ironic that I'm talking about this right now because I had scheduled or like planned out these episodes in advance, but this is the week of 4th of July, Independence Day for America, and the fact that I'm doing an episode called American Privilege this week is just so ironic, and then also the fact that my birthday is July 3rd, so like it's just very amusing to me that I'm a Independence Day baby. Have always had red, white, and blue as my like birthday theme because that's, when your parents are shopping for birthday decorations, like they just go with it. Like for a little bit of background, each of my sisters and I are holiday babies. So my sister Cynthia was born the day before Christmas Eve. My sister Liz was born on Valentine's Day, and I was born the day before Independence Day. So we all have holiday birthdays, and so it's just ironic that of all three of us, the probably least patriotic one got the 4th of July birthday. But even then, I'd say seemingly less patriotic, because the reality is, I really feel like each generation deserves to reframe how they identify their patriotism to their country. We can't necessarily have the same kind of blind patriotism that our parents or grandparents did in the 1950s. And as a millennial American, I just feel like there's a lot of housekeeping that needs to be done politically. And until we address that, we're not really going to be able to really resolve some other social issues that we have. And if anything, maybe having a podcast about the flaws of my country and its people is my most patriotic move yet. Second to my birthday, I guess, I suppose. Because the fact that I feel this strongly about it means that I care. So that's one of the way in which I feel like we need to reframe how we define our patriotism, is that, does patriotism really need to mean that we have nothing negative to say about our country, that our country is perfect, that our country is the best country on the planet, that we treat other people with respect, that we treat each other with respect, that we do what's right for all, that we care for each other as citizens of the same, land? Do we really love our neighbor? Like, how do we really display our patriotism truly? Like, I think a lot of times people think, well, I pay my taxes, I support nonprofits, I do this, I do that, and it's like, that's nice, those help, individual people. But at the same time, when you love someone, for example, you are going to tell them, I would think, when they're not being their best, like I guess this goes down to how you define love, but for me, it's like, someone who truly loves you is going to have enough respect for you to tell you when you're not your best. And to me, that's how I feel the same way about my patriotism, is that I love this country enough, and I love the people in it enough. I love the people who built it. I love the Black people who built this country enough to tell government officials, to tell friends, to tell family, to tell anyone I'm connected to that I'm not happy and I'm not pleased with the way that we are doing things, and that we've been doing things wrong, in my opinion, for a really long time and at the expense of others, and it's time to stop. And I think that is the biggest act of patriotism that anyone could ask for. And that's my challenge to a lot of my peers whose parents are white, whose parents have been here for the last 100 years, whose parents have benefited off of white supremacy, whose parents have benefited off of, just being white in general, and being in the right situation at the right time, born into the right family, born into the right race into them, like, this is my challenge to all of you. If you genuinely love your country and you genuinely want us to continue to have the luxuries that we have, and to have the ability to continue to get better and better, we have to be willing to criticize. We have to be willing to say that this is not working. And it doesn't come down to Democratic policy or Republican policy. It doesn't come down to any of that. It really doesn't even, yes, when we want change, it comes down to legislation. But it also comes down to your individual mindset shift, because policy is not going to come into place until people vote, and people are not going to vote on a common goal if they do not have a mindset shift. So it really, really begins on the individual level. And I think that's why a lot of people get tripped up about the voting thing, because they feel like the power is in the hands of the politicians. But it's like, actually, the power is in the hands of the people and the individual. And I've had to learn that myself too, that we individually have the power. But if only one of us is willing to use it, then it's not going to be enough, because the system is so large, it's so complex, it's so layered, that we also have to make a mindset shift. And we have to decide, okay, this is no longer. And this is where we start talking about generations, when we talk about Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, baby boomers, etc. When we talk about generations, we talk about a generation title is referring to sort of this encapsulation of the lifespan of people who were born at a specific time in the country and what they have gone through with world events. For example, I was born in 1994, and as I'm 25 and I'm going to be 26 in a few days, and I'm the last year, depending on what, resource you get this from, but I'm considered the last year of the millennials. It's pretty consistent that if I'm not the last year of the millennials, I am the second to last year. So I'm at the very end of that millennial generation before you start heading into the next generation. And I remember in first grade being in the classroom when 9/11 happens, going to school in Bayside, New York. Like, I remember 9/11. I remember at 6 years old watching that happen and realizing for the first time that evil existed, that it's possible for that human beings have the capacity to kill, to be violent, to hate, to destroy. I never really understood what that was. When you're 6 years old, everything is sunshine and rainbows. And so I don't think people really understand that sometimes about millennials, is that we have seen a lot of mature adult content as we've grown up, as this country continues to put its hands in the problems of other countries and leave ourselves vulnerable to those things. And I'm not trying to get into nation relations or anything like that, but I am trying to say that it really does matter that you care. It really does. It matters that you care, because when you care about something, you take action. And taking action is what we need right now. We don't need as much talking that's happening as we do action. And I just want to challenge everybody that if you're going to be doing a lot of talking, really think about what it is what's your call to action to people. Because it's not enough to complain about something, right? It's not enough to share Karens and to share these white supremacy posts. It's not enough to keep giving life to the fact that this exists, because we know it exists. You know what I mean? And if people don't want to acknowledge that it exists, then they're lost hope. Okay. But it's not enough to just share this propaganda, you guys. Like, what's the call to action? What are you calling your followers to do? What are you calling upon your friends and family to do? What is the action being taken to change the planet? Because even having the option to know that we can change something is our privilege in of itself. Okay? So I love this idea that people are finally wrapping their minds around white privilege and seeing real world examples of how white privilege exists. And that is becoming less of an argument with a lot of white people that are younger, so we're making really big strides and investments in the future adults that are going to be coming up and voting. So that's really great. A lot of these baby boomers, I don't think you're going to be able to really convince them that there's white privilege, because to them acknowledging that there is white privilege, they feel is going to be at cost to their luxuries, right? At a cost to their privilege. So when we're talking about white privilege and trying to make sure that people understand that, I'm glad that a lot of young white people are seeing that they do have privilege and trying to use it. And that idea of privilege is something that we also have to acknowledge, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation. Just merely being a citizen, either by birthright or paperwork, of America is a privilege in and of itself, because this country, good and bad, has done a lot to step on other countries and other people, other groups of people, in order to establish the luxuries that we have today. So even though you may live in a country where you don't benefit off of white privilege, you live on a planet where you benefit off of American privilege. And that's really something that I really want people that are following me to really understand. It's something I really just didn't get until I went to Dominican Republic myself and really saw how they were living. And it's not like my family was living in a hut or something crazy like that. They weren't living in the mountains in a shack, like they're living in a nice house, beautiful house, beautiful lands, everything. They had housekeepers and all that kind of stuff. They had the setup, but it's just still not America. And I think if anyone's from a third world country by ancestry or has been to one, like I said in the beginning of the episode, I really think that you can identify with what I'm saying, because you go there and you're like, wow, this has been a lot to take in. This is a lot to decompress with. I cannot wait to go home to my luxuries and just live a more grateful life. And this is why people say travel. Traveling needs to be more than just going to Europe and seeing museums and art. And, those things are great. Those things are wonderful. Don't get me wrong. But there's really something to be said about traveling in the right ways as well. Seeing the way other people live, seeing other traditions and cultures is a beautiful thing. And I have a lot of friends who travel all the time, but they also only travel to countries that are not underdeveloped. And it just says something. You know what I mean? Like, it says something because these underdeveloped countries, A, are the ones that need people to travel to them the most so they can benefit off of the tourist money. But B, you're going to get a really deep experience and a really deep kind of situation within your own self, within your own soul, when you have that experience. So this country is just very interesting in how it displays its patriotism and what is considered patriotic or not. And because everyone shows their citizenship differently. You have those who have sacrificed to emigrate here that are super patriotic because they feel like this country gave them a second chance at life. And then you have the Dixie flag, souped up truck riding people who feel like they're the front lines of patriotism. They think they're like the first Americans. And then you have the military men and women who see their patriotism as a job requirement and an expectation. And then you have the regular citizens who sort of take for granted what conveniences they have because they've never been exposed to anything else. And then you have those who feel they don't have the luxury to be patriotic because this country was built at the expense of them. And then there are those who acknowledge that its greatness was at their expense, but they also don't really want to live in that history or that past because they're afraid of not moving forward. So they overcompensate with their patriotism and ignore the history. They reject that history. We talked a little bit about this in Juneteenth, how there was a time in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, where a lot of Black people also felt that celebrating Juneteenth was un-American and that it glorified this period of slavery and that they wanted to move past that. They were over that. They were over the narrative. They were over having to hear about who their family once was. And can you really blame them? I can understand both sides of it. I fully feel like Juneteenth needs to be celebrated every year by everybody, but I can also understand and respect why there are people in the African American community who do not want to celebrate or who do not want to make time for that. So there's a lot of facets to patriotism in America, and there's something extra special about being American in a world where, as a planet, no country can deny that we have, for a very long time up until recently, controlled the earth as a superpower. And with that trading of our integrity and humanity, we have, as citizens, been given these luxuries that came at the expense of others. And my teacher in high school, Mr. Hepburn, I'll mention him a lot because he just, I've learned the most from him. He told us something really interesting one time about what free means, and free items specifically, things that are supposedly $0 value in the store. He said, in business, nothing is free. When you see signs that say buy one, get one free, that second free item isn't actually free. Either another item is being marked up to compensate for that free item, or there was an upcharge on that item for weeks prior, leading up to the sale of it becoming buy one, get one free. So a lot of it is marketing, you guys. Seasons come and go with items, and they need to get rid of things, and they mark them up, but then they mark them down, and that's business. And nothing is ever truly free in America. So there's always a cost somewhere to somebody, even for the things that are free. And when we're talking about white privilege, what that's really saying, you guys, is that in order for Black people to truly be free, to truly be able to freely walk around the store and not be followed or be harassed, in order for Black people to be able to go on a jog without being killed by two white guys in a truck recording it, in order for a Black kid to go get some Skittles and an Arizona iced tea from the 7-Eleven, in order for them to be free to do those things, there's going to be a cost to white people and their privilege in order to keep Black lives safe. And this is really important for people to understand, that it's not really actually costing you anything in the immediate other than acknowledging you have privilege, 1, voting policy that protects the lives of Black people, 2, and 3, redistributing that wealth amongst these communities that is owed to them. Because just any white person you see today that's upper class, the ability for them to even be there, and I'm not talking about how hard they worked or anything like that. I'm sure that's all true. But somewhere in history, for every rich American in this country, that has been able to be done by the back of a black person somewhere. Whether it was a slave who was owned by a white person that is in their lineage, etc. Every ounce of privilege in this country has been on the backs of black slaves and on the backs of other countries who we have bullied into submission, who we have insider wars with. Look at Mexico. Mexico is a fraction of the size that it used to be, simply because America had the strategy and the president decided that there was manifest destiny. He wanted to manifest destiny and decide to take 3/4 of Mexico from them by inciting a war on the border. And look at where they are now. And we're still pimping them out to this day as a country. So when we talk about American privilege, you guys, we have to really get down to the root of it. And you might be wondering, okay, American privilege, we get it. Where is this going? Well, this goes into so many different, it's like a huge fork in the road. It goes into so many different roads. The first fork in the road is in acknowledging our American privilege in the first place. We have to acknowledge how it is we treat other countries, especially these, quote, third world ones. Mind you, third world isn't even technically defined by the way that we speak of it. It's not even really a term that we should be using still to this day. A lot of people now prefer people to start saying developing countries because that's really what they are. But the term third world itself has its origins coming off of the Cold War, and it was used as a term to define countries that remained non-aligned with NATO or the Warsaw Pact. So the United States, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Western European countries, and their allies represented the first world, while the post-Soviet Union countries, China, Cuba, and their allies were the second world. So this term was a way to start broadly categorizing nations that occupied the earth into 3 groups based on political and economic divisions. So the third world was normally seen to include many countries with colonial past in Africa, Latin America, Asia, etc. It was also sometimes taken as synonymous with countries in the non-aligned movement. There's a thing called dependency theory, where the third world has also been connected to the world's systemic economic division as like periphery countries dominated by countries comprising the core. So basically what I'm saying is that a lot of people, when they're talking about third world, they're referring to countries that depend on, or what they believe countries depend on first world countries like United States, for example, to help them out, to be partners in imports and exports, etc. So most third world countries are former colonies. Having gained independence, many of these countries, especially the smaller ones, were faced with challenges of nation and institution building on their own for the first time. And due to this common background, many of these nations were developing in economic terms for most of the 20th century, and many still are. So this term really just refers to countries that are still developing right now. And there was an economist named Peter Bauer, and in the 1980s, he had like a competing definition for the term third world. He claimed that the attachment of third world status to a particular country was not based on any stable economic or political criteria and was a mostly arbitrary process. And the large diversity of countries considered part of the third world were from Indonesia and Afghanistan, and they ranged widely from economically primitive as fuck to economically advanced as fuck, and from politically non-aligned to Soviet or Western leaning. So his argument was made that parts of the US even are more like third world. So we have to really understand and acknowledge our history because it's what shows us in current times how, why, and in what ways we have privilege and luxuries today. Even the poorest in our first world country live marginally better than ones in Zimbabwe, for example, because we have an infrastructure that has been built to aid individuals with our social programs in order to give them the help and the hope that they need, whether it's WIC or food stamps, etc. There are people wandering around other countries right now as we speak who have no idea where they can find water. So we really need to be thinking in terms of American privilege because whether we like it or not, other countries, especially third world ones, look to us as American citizens, as leaders on how to function from the policy level, from a governing level, from a military level, from a social level, etc. When we as a country make it okay to shoot Black people dead first and ask questions later, and then say that we have the best justice system on the planet, we reverberate these atrocities not only through our own country, but through the other ones who are still trying to develop what it is that they even stand for. So like a lot of white people are needing to do right now, we need to be also, one, taking accountability for our position and relationship with other people, other countries. That's the first road in this fork, like I just mentioned in discussion of third world versus first world, etc. Two, we need to actually flesh out what freedom really means by looking at what it has meant to not just white people here, but to other communities of color, really taking a look at history and being honest with ourselves. So I'm asking you guys this. Do you truly believe you are free? Do you? Do you think you are truly free to say whatever you want, to do whatever you want, to dress however you want, to love whoever you want? Because one large defining difference I observe between the Dominican Republic and the US is when it comes to law enforcement. Law enforcement in this country does not fuck around compared to what is going on in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic, their police walk around with visibly seen rifles. There's no type of subtlety about who they are, and they will pull you over for whatever, whenever, and it's not uncommon for them to pull you over just so that the driver will be forced to hand them some money so that they will leave them alone and get them on their way. So it's a very corrupt system in developing countries. And I'm not saying that our police is not corrupt here, but we don't have a situation where we need to be slipping them $100 bills in order to get them to leave us alone, okay? So if the citizens of the United States are not free to do whatever we want per the laws that are in place, then we need to have a balance of democracy in our country and say, then police can also do whatever they want. Law enforcement should not be above the law, the same way that not all decisions in Washington, D.C. can come from the president. There are two other branches involved in decision making in order to keep a balance between different issues and policies. So it is deeply our responsibility and privilege to understand how to maneuver in this country, even down to things like teaching our kids to know their rights, teaching them how they can use that to advocate for themselves. It's not going to be a surefire way to stop Black kids from being killed. I'm not saying any of that, but there are a lot of instances in relation to mass incarceration where there are a lot of Black bodies in there for no reason other than them and not knowing their rights because of our education system, because of the socioeconomic conditions they grew up in. And knowing this, understanding this, and spreading this kind of word is how we can start bringing calls to action. This is how we truly begin to use our American privilege to dismantle America's systems as we know it today. So the third road in this fork is how we relate our patriotism with our humanity. We shouldn't be so blind with patriotism that we forsake human decency. In an effort to define their patriotism, a lot of people have developed xenophobia. And for those who don't know what that means, xenophobia is a fear or a dislike or prejudice against people from other countries. And we have a really layered issue with xenophobia in our country. Just like there are Hispanics that reject their own Blackness, there are also Black people who reject a lot in regards to Hispanic immigration. And there are a lot of Black people right now who turn a blind eye to the children that are in cages in Texas as we speak. But the difference I've always felt is that the education system has not served Black communities in this country with even their own history. So they're not going to be able to also completely understand and advocate for the lives of others when they're literally just trying to stay alive themselves. You see what I'm saying? So this podcast is important for understanding Black history, but also most importantly where it meets with Hispanic culture and history, and where we intersect, and how I am trying to explain who we are, what we are, and the nuances of our culture to show my Black listeners, my Hispanic listeners, my other listeners of whatever race, that there's so much overlap that Black people have with everyone. You see, there's something particularly complex about Black and white people because of how white people have colonized and Black people have been enslaved. And the rest of us that are on the outside, whether you're a Middle Eastern or Asian or Hispanic, whatever, the rest of us on the outside are in a lot of ways still deeply connected to these groups because of the institutions that were led by white people against Black people. So it's just really important to me for people to see the connection that I see between Hispanics and Black people. But in order for that to happen, we are the ones who need to be bridging the gap. And the reason I believe we need to be the ones to make that first step, that first olive branch extension, is because we are going to be a large population of voters in 2030. It's been projected that 40% of the growth in the US electorate between now and 2030 is going to increase the number of eligible Hispanic voters from 23.7 million to 40 million, you guys. So a 40% of the growth, okay? 40% of the voting population is going to be made up of Hispanic people. So I am very passionate about these kinds of topics because it is so important to me for my people to be spoken to the way they need to be spoken to, one, and two, for them to understand simultaneously their own history, their own culture and traditions, but also Black people and their history, because Black people are being killed right now, you guys, and it's important for us as Hispanics to take on this issue as well, because we need to be voting out the people who do not have their best interest and our best interest in heart, and voting in the people who genuinely do. So this episode is really around a call to action to my listeners. We have gone through so many topics discussing the origins between Black and Hispanic people, but I really want this 10th episode to kind of be like a review episode of really fleshing out what it is the call to action needs to be for us as communities of people who are looking to really make change, because the real call to action is a mental shift, okay? And the mental shift comes with information. And the information today is that we have American privilege and we need to acknowledge it for what it is. American privilege is a real thing, just like white privilege is. And the thing about American privilege is that it extends to a global scale. This is discussion about where we would like to see ourselves in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, etc. I really believe we're going to be the first generation to actually ask ourselves as a whole community, as all millennials and younger. I think we're going to be the first generation to actually look at things through the tool of social media as one whole perspective and say, okay, the majority agrees that these things are not working and we need to change them. And it's sort of like what you do on an individual level, except I think the tool of social media has made us more empathetic, more understanding, smarter, more emotionally intelligent. And I think that social media has created this doorway for the human experience to get elevated to such a level, you guys. Because when the human experience was in colonization and slavery, that kind of mentality was very low level thinking. It was very like survival 101, right? It was, well, if I'm either going to be the enslaved person or the slave master. And so we are no longer living in that sort of time exactly anymore. if you are not a Black person. And this is why we talk about white privilege. So when we talk about communities of color and how we can like really make this something that intersects within all communities, it requires us to look at this from this perspective of the fact that we need to take responsibility as a country for what we have gone through, what we have put others through. And maybe that wasn't our doing as millennials or subsequent generations, but we are a part of a country and we have inherited that history, right? So the question is, do you know your history? Okay, no. So let's learn it. Let's learn all of it. Let's really get in there. And once we have learned everything that there is to know, and we have had these deep discussions on what that means in present day, how are we going to tie all of this knowledge that we have together and move forward on a better note? Because this podcast is not about being cynical or judgmental. Although I may have cynical thoughts and judgmental thoughts, the real goal for me, you guys, is that we are going to use our American privilege for the optimism that has always been embedded in the American spirit. Because even when Black people were enslaved, they still had that hope. They still had that spirit. They are the heart of America. Black people are. They are the backbone and they are the heart. They are the ones who have kept and have instilled this actual feeling of hope and optimism of the ability to succeed in life despite what your circumstances are. Because a lot of people want to say that that's the white people that moved here, but that's not the case. Because white people when they came to America, were always depending on someone else to help them, whether it was them depending on Native Americans for food and to work the land, whether it was enslaving Black people to actually work the land that they just learned to work in the first place by Native Americans. White people have always leaned on everyone else to figure out their problems for them. And so the American spirit truly doesn't lay in the white people who depended on everyone else to help them. The American spirit is in the Mexicans, it's in the Black slaves, it's in the Native Americans. That American spirit comes from those groups of peoples. And I'm going to show you guys how that is so while we go back in time through history. It is my firm belief that by going back in time and having a deeper understanding and fresh perspective, we can make the correct moves forward, because mental thought processes are ever changing right now. They are continuously happening every day as people are continuing to learn more and grow. But we have to have a clear objective, or we will get fatigued by the cause and its heaviness easily. And I made this podcast especially because of the fact that I have not always had access to education. I have not had equal access to education the way maybe like my oldest sister did, because my family just went through different things during my time. So it's important for me as someone who's had to self-educate to provide this tool to people who don't have access to education, who don't have access to this kind of thinking. Because while you guys have access to social media or to Google to look up this stuff yourselves, and I encourage you to do so, the access to education means something more. When you go to college, you don't just learn the material. You have open forums, you have discussions, we have there's dialogue about what it is that you're studying at that time. And people don't get that in their day-to-day lives. A lot of people don't have people in their lives where they can have these kinds of conversations with them because they just don't get it. So this is really about building a community of people who want to have the hard conversations and who want to have a clear objective. So on that note, I feel like I'm so ready for next episode, you guys, because we're going to be discussing some more world issues and how epigenetics has played a huge role in the traumas of communities of colors and their issues that they're facing today. I've had a lot of white peers say, why do they keep talking about slavery? They weren't the ones who were slaves. That was like 100 years ago. A lot of people share this sentiment, and it's because they do not know a damn thing about epigenetics and how while Black people today may not be in the situation they were in 100 years ago, they are still carrying the traumas and mental illnesses that were coming from their ancestors and have bred down the line in their ancestry from that time period. White people and their privilege have been able to look past and continue to move forward and just try to forget that all this happened. But I believe that half of the mental illness we see today in people on an individual level actually comes from ancestry traumas passed through epigenetics that we are not even aware of, because most of us are not that connected to our ancestors and their lives. It's going to be a very interesting podcast episode, so please join me on Thursday, you guys. See you then. Bye.